Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall, and welcome to The Meaningful Life. On today's podcast, we're going to be discussing synchronicity, the coincidences which seem to conspire to tell us something, teach us something, or turn our life around. My guest is Robert Hopcke, who is a Jungian analyst and a licensed marriage and family therapist from California, and the author of There Are No Accidents, Synchronicity and the Stories of Our Lives, and There Are No Accidents in Love and Relationships. Now, synchronicity is one of the terms from Jung that's entered into the popular imagination. How did he define it, and what does it mean?
Well, it's great to be here, Andrew. Thanks so much. And I always say that at the beginning of my lecture. It's one of those interesting things, along with extroversion and introversion, again, coinages by Jung that have entered into popular parlance. Synchronicity, too. I'm always having to correct people. Sting and the Police did not coin the term synchronicity. He used it. I frequently say that everything you need to know about synchronicity is in the title of his actual book. The book that he published on synchronicity in 1950 in his late life is called Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. So how he defined it was he wanted to establish a principle of connection that was parallel to the principle of connection that underlies scientific empirical science, which is cause and effect. You know, we have a material cause and then there's an effect, we observe them. What he wanted to do was establish synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle in which two events, either an inner event or an outer event, or two inner events, were connected through psychological meaning. So instead of it being a physics, he was thinking about it as psyche. It was a psychological connection. So that's why it was acausal in a sense. It was like the connection is there between two events, the coincidence, and those two events are connected through their meaning. So it's very appropriate. I'm on a podcast called The Meaningful Life, because meaning is the essence of synchronicity. So that's the quick and easy way to say it, I think, for people to understand, which is a synchronistic event is a meaningful coincidence. We have coincidences all the time that occur that aren't necessarily all that meaningful or significant. And you and I can go into a bit, what does meaning mean, in this context. But, two things can happen at once and they don't necessarily have that much significance to somebody. A synchronistic event takes into account the psychological, interior, subjective, symbolic, emotional meaning of the event to the person.
Now, I'm going to give a quote of yours, which I thought was really illustrated this, and perhaps you can sort of explain it to me. It's like plot developments that make us feel like a character in a grand mysterious. It's plot developments that make us feel like a character in a grand mysterious story. So can you expand and explain that?
Yeah, that comes from my book, There Are No Accidents. What happened in the course of my writing about synchronicity, which I've been doing for probably about 30 years, was when I was getting the material together to write the book, because I'd written a number of different articles for Jungian journals on it, it became kind of clear to me that when I would ask people about the synchronistic events they had experienced, they began to tell me a story. Everything sort of turned into a narrative. And that put me on the track of the kind of quote you just read. In other words, what became clear was there was a narrative coherence to people's lives that they were largely unconscious of until the synchronistic event or the meaningful coincidence occurred to them, which brought them to an awareness of that coherence. You and I are just sort of walking around living our lives, and we're sort of largely unconscious of the deeper connections that we may be living. You and I are thinking about the grocery list, or getting gas for the car, getting to work, having our coffee, etc. And then something occurs, and suddenly we're catapulted into a deeper level of awareness of the connections we have either with the outer world, with other people, with our own past. And those are the sorts of things that suddenly, when that happens, it feels as if we're a character in a novel. We see what happened in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of our lives has a connection to chapters 9 and 10 in our lives. And that's what a synchronistic event, I found, brings to people's awareness. So that was the approach I took in the book. The subtitle of the book is Synchronicity in the Stories of Our Lives, because the synchronistic events begin to shape themselves into a narrative. Now, there's a psychological reason for that, that you and I can get into in the course of this podcast. There's a psychological reason for that experience of coherence. That is why Jung wrote about synchronicity. He used synchronicity as an illustration of a particular point he wanted to make about our underlying wholeness and coherence as psychological beings in the world. So that's a little bit what comes across on the upper level when people start telling me their synchronicity story. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. There's a narrative coherence to it. So it does feel, oftentimes people will say, oh my gosh, it's the kind of thing that only happens in movies. It's the kind of thing that only happens in books. And I always turn that on its head. I mean, it happens in movies and books because it actually happens to us in our real lives. Right? I mean, I always sort of say books and movies aren't natural phenomena. They just don't fall out of the sky. People write them. They write them because there's this experience of meaning is then expressed in works of fashioned fiction that then express that meaningfulness.
And in fact, real life is sometimes stranger than the movies, because often writers will actually say, well, nobody would believe that, so we have to throw that away. Even though it really happened, nobody would actually believe that.
I've been a therapist for 40 years. I can tell you can imagine the kinds of stories that I've heard. I mean, the stuff I've heard, I was just like, yeah, no one would ever believe that if you would actually put it on. So that's why, all the stories in the books that I've written, the 2 books that I've written, the first one's a more general book, and then the second one is about synchronicity and family relationships, love and family relationships. They're kind of incredible. It's one of the most exciting and sort of interesting things about doing this research for all these years. It's like the most amazing things occur, like the most improbable, impactful, unbelievable, really, frankly, unbelievable sorts of things occur. Yeah, exactly. But that's what that quote goes to, the narrative quality of these events and how they awaken us to the deeper meaning of our lives.
So I think the best example we could give of a synchronistic story is your own story, because you were adopted and the way you found your mother is a synchronistic story, isn't it? Do you mind sharing it with us?
Not at all. I'm more than happy to. I mean, and in a way, it's a story that illustrates the different aspects of synchronicity, in a particular way. Yeah, I was adopted at birth. I was brought home by my adoptive Hopcke parents at 3 days old. I was adopted at birth. And in the course of my life, growing up, I had a very happy childhood. I'm very happy with the Hopkes. I had a wonderful childhood. I have an adopted sister. There was a lot of adoptees, I think, feel sort of mismatched or kind of out of place or alienated or whatever. And that was not my case. I had a very happy childhood. But what was one of the more interesting things about my development was growing up in New Jersey, outside of New York. There was nothing but Italians and Jews in my hometown. So there I am. And suddenly I took French. I spoke French fluently after spending a summer in France when I was 14. I came back, I started taking Italian. Now, no one's seeing me at this point. I've got sort of, silver hair. I'm 63 years old. But at the time I had dark curly hair, and so here I am in this very Germanic family. And I look sort of like this Fellini character in the middle of a Bergman film, like I'm the big extroverted, dark haired, loud, funny Italian guy. I'm taking Italian and I'm gravitating to all the Italian friends, and everyone's just like, wow, and then it began to, so what happened to me was I got into my own analysis and I began to have dreams about Italian parents, my Italian mother, my Italian father, and my analyst at the time was sort of poking at it. I mean, appropriately poking at it. I was an analysis, right? But it wasn't really, finding my background, my birth parents wasn't something that was really on my radar until it started presenting itself to me in my dreams. Now, it sort of made all sense. I mean, I was a French-Italian major at Georgetown. I lived in Florence.
my experience in Florence and subsequently in Italy is that I'm often mistaken for an actual Italian, because I looked Italian, I acted Italian. So my analyst was like, I bet one of your birth parents or both your birth parents are Italian, right? So I was like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. Now, my late husband and I would go to Italy for vacation every 2 years, pretty much for a month. And I would like, okay, that's kind of interesting. So when I was in 1990, I finally was poked enough to sort of start to do some research. So I contacted the adoption agency in Jersey City. The social worker that had done my adoption was still working there. I was only 27 years old, which was, now that I'm 63 and I've practiced here in Berkeley for 40 years, that doesn't seem all that strange to me. I was like, she was stable. She remembers my adoption. She remembered my adoptive parents, all of it. But, the laws are such that she couldn't disclose non-identifying information, but she was identifying information. She couldn't disclose identifying information, but she could disclose non-identifying information. And she did say that my mother's background, my birth mother's background, was Italian. So I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, if you're Italian, Italian is this sort of like catch-all term. In Italy, everyone's very identified with their specific town or region. Italian is sort of like this thing that's kind of applied on top of their major cultural identity. They're from Naples, or they're Florence, or they're Roman, or they're Milanese, and then they're Italian. So that started working on me. I was like, well, where is my family from? Italy's a very large place. I could be from the north, I could be from the south. It sort of mattered to me. So one summer before I went, I decided I was going to contact the agency again and do an actual formal search. So what occurs here in the States, in New Jersey in particular, because the laws are different from state to state here, if both adult parties give consent, if my birth mother had given consent at the time of my adoption to disclose the information to me, should I want it, then they would just disclose it. There's no court process. It's kind of an easy disclosure thing. So the social worker had since retired. A new Lutheran pastor, was a Lutheran adoption agency. A Lutheran pastor had taken over, and he was very wary of giving me any information. So in the course of this sort of emotional, I wouldn't say turmoil, sort of overstating it a bit, but all of these issues are up for me emotionally. I'm eager to find out my background. I'm going to Italy in a short period of time. I want this information. I have this dream, and the dream is really simple. The dream is, your mother's name is Gloria. Some voice says to me, my mother's name is Gloria. Well, my Hopcke mother's name is Gloria Hopcke, was Gloria Hopcke. She passed away in 2001. But, so I was like, okay, well, that's kind of, and I talked to my husband and friends, and they were like, well, of course you had that dream. Your mother's name is Gloria. So I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. So I get on the phone. It's about a week before we're supposed to leave to Italy. And this pastor is just refusing to give me information that I'm actually legally entitled to. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in California. I know what the family laws are. I'm like, you need to give me this information. And I just got kind of ticked off at him. And I said, kind of in a bit of a rush, I was like, God wants me to have this information. And he's like, because he was a Lutheran pastor, right? And I was like, okay, I'm going to work the religious angle. God wants me to have this information. And he's like, how does God know you want that? I said, because God told me her name in a dream. And he's like, really? I said, yeah. You get that folder out and you open it up and you look at her name, and I'm going to tell you her name because God told me her name. And he said, okay. And I said, her name is Gloria. And he screamed and dropped the phone. Because as it turns out, both my mother's names are Gloria. It was the weirdest thing. Who knew, right? But my birth mother's name was Gloria. Well, he was so freaked out by it. He gave me all the information on the spot. He was afraid, I don't know, that God would send out a bolt of lightning and kill him for being such a jerk. But so I got her information that way. That's how I got her information. And, the the address that she had been living at my adoption 27 years before was my aunt's address. It was very easy to just go to the phone book. This is way before the internet and ancestry.com or any of that, right? It was 1990. I just went to the New Jersey phone book here at the Berkeley Public Library and looked her up. And I was talking to her the next day. And it turns out, yeah, she's Italian, second youngest of 14 kids. I'm the youngest of 65 cousins. It's like a small nation. The Abatello family is sort of a small nation. But I have since been weirdly, I have since been to the two towns my grandparents came from. My great-grandparents emigrated over here separately, and my grandparents met here. So my grandparents were born in two different but very close towns outside of Benevento. I've seen my grandmother's birth record in that town. So the kid who was adopted out of the Italian family at birth is the one who speaks Italian, lived in Italy, went to school in Italy, found the birth records of all the family. So the family is contacting me all the time saying, like, where are they from and where do I go? And I was like, it's so funny. So my birth mother is still alive. She's in Florida, but that was the synchronistic event. That was sort of like, wow. And as I said, I think it really illustrates an awful lot about synchronicity. First of all, it's acausal. It's not like I discovered the information about my mother's actual name by doing an ancestry.com search, right? That would be causal. Like, in other words, I intend to find it, I do X, Y, and Z, and I find it. It came to me. It came to me in a particular way. The second aspect of it, and synchronistic events constantly, are emotional. Like, there's a level of emotional, what do I want to say? Emotional charge. Yeah, charge around the event. That's in part what makes it meaningful. It's not just a meaningless coincidence, which is kind of curious and interesting and kind of amusing. It has a deeper meaning and impact, right? There's a symbolic quality to it, always. I mean, there's her name. Her name has a symbolism, to it, which is very interesting. A lot of times in synchronistic events, it'll be an image, it'll be a specific situation. A number of different things can have a symbolic. We can talk a bit about that because we'll talk about other stories, but there are other symbols besides that. But, it was her name that came to me. So her name was symbolic in a particular way. And then the fourth aspect is transition. Synchronistic events always, I found, happen in times of transition for people. They bring them from some place to someplace else, either mentally, emotionally, psychologically, or actually literally, in some cases. So that's a great story. That's why I start the second book out with that story, because I found when I was doing research for the first book, people would tell me an awful lot of stories about synchronicity between themselves and other family members. And I hadn't really planned for that in the first book. And I had so many stories that I decided to go forward and do a second book on synchronicity and family stories. And that's how I lead. That story is mine. Because I was like, wow, that's a very interesting. I didn't intend to find my birth mother, and yet it came to me in a dream in such a way. And the one piece of information I needed to unlock the institutional logjam from my getting that information is the one piece of information I got in the dream. And it just so happens both my mothers have the same name, which is, again, if you wrote it, like you said, if you wrote it in a novel, people wouldn't believe it, but that is in fact what the case is. So,
and the person you had on the other end of the phone was a true believer who, other people would say, oh yeah, you're pulling my leg, but he believed you.
Well, and that's the interesting thing about it, particularly when it comes to like that level, but either the religious or spiritual dimensions of this, correct, right? I have a whole chapter in the first book on spirituality and religion, synchronicity in people's spiritual lives, right? Because what'll happen is, if you're a true believer, as you just said about him, it's very easy, if you're a true believer, to explain the synchronicity, right? I mean, that's a little bit what I was sort of using that in a way to sort of get the information I needed, because his explanation as a pastor would be that God had sent me that information in a dream. Now, Jung would disagree with that in the sense that he would say that might be true, that might not be true. And in either of those cases, that's a causal explanation. In other words, if you believe there's a God in heaven and God communicates with human beings in such a specific way, you're entitled to that belief. But that's a causal explanation of the event. God is causing me to have that information. Jung was agnostic in that sense, as when he was wearing his psychological hat, right? He was agnostic. He was like, well, that might be true. That might not be true. That's your belief. You're entitled to that belief. I'm over here on the other side of the fence looking at the psychology of religion. I'm looking at how your religious beliefs function for you psychologically and emotionally. And if you believe it's true, then it's true for you subjectively. You don't have to prove it objectively. Subjectively, it's true. And so that's important to understand when it comes to a synchronistic event. In other words, if you believe it's so, it's so. That's your particular meaning, which is why a synchronistic event, the same external event could happen to two people. And for one person, it could be synchronistic. And for another person, it doesn't have any meaning at all. It's the same event. It's the subjective meaning or the belief one has about the event that one brings to it spontaneously and unconsciously that makes it synchronistic. And that's a great example of it. Sure, God could have sent me that information, but if I believe God sent me that information, that is what makes it a synchronistic event. When the external event of my mother's name coincides with the internal dream that I had, in which the identity of their names creates a situation that unlocks something that needed to be unlocked for me emotionally, so that I could move forward into greater integration of my own identity in my own life and own the other parts of who I am with an objective foundation behind them by discovering who my birth parents were and what my actual ethnic heritage is, from them.
And how do you what meaning do you attach to this this meaningful coincidence?
For me, I would say the significance of it for me was that it closed an open question about my origins that in a way I didn't even know I had. I had such a lovely childhood and upbringing, and was close to my parents. It wasn't like I felt very dissatisfied or troubled at all by my upbringing. But what I didn't realize was that how important it was for me to locate myself in the place that my people came from on this earth.
So it's so your conscious life was saying, I'm fine with all these Germans, but your unconscious was saying, actually, it might be quite good to know a few Italians.
In fact, it's almost sort of after the fact, I found myself gravitating to and being in communities of Italian American immigrants that I was going to school with, living in Italy, going to Florence, long before it even consciously occurred to me that I might actually be ethnically Italian, right? And so that's the way I kind of say it. I mean, the integration, I say I was adopted to and raised by Germans. I had a German upbringing, but I'm actually ethnically Italian. And so I identify myself as an Italian American, which, everyone's sort of, and it's easy too, because everyone says, Hopcke, what kind of an Italian name is that? And then I just say, my mother was Italian. And that sort of explains, I don't have to go into the big, long 20-minute story that I just went into. Everyone's like, oh yeah, no, his mother was Italian. And everyone knows that I lived in Italy and speak Italian fluently. I've done translation work, etc. So it augmented, and I would say, in a way, consolidated a certain kind of sense of myself that I was living from the inside out. By that inside out, a subjective experience of being Italian was then met with the objective reality of my actually being of genetic Italian heritage.
So could you give us another example so that we can really truly understand what you mean by synchronicity?
Well, some of the other examples, I think I could start with the the story that I to move away from families a bit and get a bit to my clinical work, like how I actually got into this, to tell you the truth, as a clinician, because a synchronistic event occurred to me in my work with a client. And I had never really even heard of the term synchronicity when this occurred. I was an intern. I was in my early 20s. I was working with an older man who was who was in therapy because he was trying to get himself free from a very domineering mother. One of the, I'm working as best I can as an intern, a rather inexperienced younger person, somebody who's 30 years older than me, who's contending with a really complicated, sophisticated problem. And, he's coming in week after week talking to me, just telling me about how awful his mother is and how controlling she is and how he needs her financially and all of his conflicts about it and blah, blah, blah. Can't move out, this, that. And I'm being very empathic. But I don't know really how effective I'm actually being, being somewhat inexperienced. And, I'm talking to somebody the age of my father, but I was doing my best. I was being empathic and definitely trying to help him figure out kind of what kinds of actions he could take little by little to kind of free himself from his mother's control. So there's this one session we're having at the agency I was working at, and it's California. It's the middle of winter. We're having this terrible, terrible storm. And so the terrible, terrible storm that's happening is like, it's roaring outside the window. And he's in his space in our session telling me how powerless he feels. I feel so powerless against her. I can't take anything. Every time I do this, she takes my power away. So I feel powerless. And then all of a sudden, boom, all the electricity goes off.
Wow.
In the building. And I'm like, and so the two of us are sitting there in the quasi darkness, like there's a small window in the room, but it's dark. It's a dark, stormy night, so to speak. He doesn't even notice the power goes off. He's just in his space. And I'm like, wow, there was an emotional power failure, and now there's a literal power failure. So I continued our session talking to him, and I think the darkness and the storm got him into his own internal space. And I just talked to him really gently. And I was like, I understand how powerless you feel, but I think there are ways in which, you're sort of have habituated yourself to this particular way of thinking about or acting with her. And I think there are ways in which you could actually exert your control and authority over your own life that you haven't really fully explored. And I numbered a few of those. And he looked at me and it sort of sunk in. He was like, oh, so you're saying I'm actually powerful? I said, well, I think you could be much more powerful than you have been and are being. And he's like, powerful? I'm powerful. I'm powerful. And all the lights go back on.
Wow. Double wow.
It was like you were saying earlier, it's these stories that, if you sort of saw it in a movie, you'd be like, okay, that's pretty hokey. But I was like, whoa, okay. Now, I'm an intern therapist, so I'm seeing symbolism in everything, right? He's the client. He's just wanting to get better. He's not looking to explore. But it was very synchronistic, right? And so I go to my supervisor, who's this dyed-in-the-wool Freudian psychoanalyst. And she's like, oh, that's one of those things Jung called synchronicity in a very dismissive fashion. And that was the first time I'd heard the word. So that's an example, I think a little bit more of a typical example in a way in which a really random event, that is to say the failure of the electrical transformer in North Berkeley, coincided with a particular emotional state and a particular interaction that was happening between two people. And it's also a good example of how, for me, it was quite synchronistic. For the client didn't even notice the power had gone on or off. The client's like having his session over there in his own psychic space, very symbolic. The essence of the synchronicity was the way in which the actual literal power failure mirrors the metaphorical or emotional power failure the client is seeing, right? And it was a time of transition. It moved him from A to B in terms of his self-conception. So that's another example of it. I did a couple of articles because I found that in doing some research, there were a number of Jungian analysts who had actually written about the way in which psychotherapy, the psychotherapy session, is in fact a liminal space, so to speak. In other words, it's a place that people go in which they are voluntarily attempting to shed a former experience or conception of themselves, which hasn't been working for them, in order to move forward into a new and more consolidated, coherent, and integrated identity. And the therapy session is the middle stage of that, in which you're in this clean, clear space, liminal meaning threshold space, in between space, and you explore possibilities, you open yourself up to things. And so a number of analysts had written about psychotherapy as a liminal space. And I found that many, many times, synchronistic events would occur to me with the client in the middle of sessions. In the middle of a psychotherapy session, something synchronistic would occur that would, sometimes the client was aware of it, unlike that situation. Sometimes the client was aware of it, sometimes they weren't. And then, of course, when I went to Jung's famous story in his own book about synchronicity was with a client who was discussing a dream of a scarab beetle, that she had had. And in the middle of their session, an actual scarab beetle flies into the room and lands, and Jung catches it and sort of says, "Here is your beetle," to the client. So that's an example of in-session synchronicities that I would have with people, right? And so that's another example of it. Synchronicities that occur in the middle of it in psychotherapy. It was really kind of how I got into it. So sometimes they're personal, sometimes they're clinical, sometimes they're completely unexpected. The first book.
And how do you actually use an event like that? So the scarab beetle, you've produced the scarab beetle,
right.
How do you actually use that in a meaningful way rather than just a sort of a conjuring trick?
Well, yes, I think that's basically the question, isn't it? I mean, I follow Jung, and Jung talked about this a great deal. In fact, Jung's wrote 18 volumes of material on the psyche, right? One of the major themes that Jung writes about is the way in which psychotherapy and integration occurs when we open ourselves up to the symbolic level of the life that we live. So I think on the most basic level, when a synchronistic event hits someone over the head in a way that they can't actually ignore, like that, you're dreaming about a beetle and the beetle actually flies and lands on your lap. You can't really ignore that. Jung used it clinically in order to make this client, and I use it to make my clients aware of the potential symbolic quality of the everyday life that they live. Your podcast is called A Meaningful Life. That's one of the ways to create a meaningful life. I mean, we could go about living our lives literally, and there would be no harm to that, really. But the point of psychotherapy is to live a meaningful life. And the way to do that is by being alive to the symbolism that events or objects or people or situations present to us, right? And his definition of symbol, I also use, which I think is relevant here. A symbol is an image that points to a truth that cannot be fully known. In other words, not be fully known. Correct. In other words, a symbol is in a way infinite and endless. You can have like the scarab beetle is a good example of it, or even my mother's name, but we'll use the scarab beetle when we're talking about it. What Jung does with that scarab beetle is, first of all, it has a symbolic quality as an insect, a sort of lower form of life that comes in. It has iridescent wings, so the multicolors mean something. It is also, Jung says, it's also connected with Egyptian mythology in a variety of different ways, because it's a symbol of death and rebirth. In other words, also a sacred symbol, things flying, birds, bugs, hummingbirds tend to be symbols of the spirit, because spirit is connected with air. In other words, this one sort of humble little insect as an image in human experience and across time archetypally
has various aspects that symbolize, that point to basic human experiences we all have, that if we become aware of them through the action of the symbol, creates a richer, deeper, fuller experience of our life than we would have otherwise. So that's the point of it. The point is we want to take, when a synchronistic event occurs to a client or to a friend or to me, I like to meditate on what it might be bringing me into an awareness of underneath the surface of my literal everyday life. It's a way in which, sometimes you just sort of stop. The reason it has an impact, I think, is largely because it connects in a certain way with something I'm already either subconsciously or unconsciously alive to, that I need to bring to the surface and integrate into my consciousness. So how do you use it? We use it as a tool in a way, an opportunity maybe, or an occasion to bring what's subconscious or unconscious to fuller consciousness. And then for us to actually either embrace it or simply appreciate it, perhaps sometimes ritualize it, sometimes actually create the symbol and actually use it in ritual in order to remind us of what its meaning is for us.
And I think it gets us in contact with the mysterious nature of the world, isn't it?
Well, that's what's so lovely. I mean, I think particularly, in Western civilization, and this is why Jung wanted to contrast synchronicity to empirical science, right? I mean, we're so often literally, objectively, or materially focused, sometimes that's just due to, everyday survival. We need to get to work. We need to get to car work. We need, make our income. We need to feed ourselves. We need to bathe ourselves, And, but to go about one's life in such a sort of a narrow band of material or literal concerns is really not that soul feeding. It doesn't feed your soul. And I think particularly kind of in the modern world, in which a lot of religious and or spiritual beliefs, systems, or institutions have either been discredited or people have sort of just spontaneously, naturally, organically moved away from them, thinking about them. What Jung wanted to do with his psychological approach and what we do in analysis by looking at these events is to sort of re-enchant the world, to kind of, from the disenchantment of modern life and Western civilization, there's a way in which from within, if we actually foster a symbolic and emotionally aware consciousness of what's mysteriously unconscious within ourselves, we can re-enchant the world and sort of bring forward a fuller and deeper experience than we might otherwise. And that's sort of the point in psychotherapy. Jung posited that, and this gets back to one of the earlier points you and I were talking about, Jung posited that we all, in a way, are our own wholeness. We all make sense on some basic level. We are who we are. The point of his analytic theory was what he called individuation. So when people hear that, a lot of times they hear the word individual and they think, you want to be who you actually are individually. That's the point of therapy, and that's there. But Jung actually meant that term in the more etymological sense of the term. In other words, he wanted somebody to be individuated, that is to say, undivided, not divided, individuated. And that's what individual means. That's the second, if you're an individual, that's the secondary phenomenon. The primary phenomenon is you brought all the various parts of yourself together. You've been individuated. The divisions no longer are there, and you're now undivided. You're whole.
In what way are most people divided then?
I think they're divided a lot of times because, and this is where Jung sort of stands in the long tradition of depth psychology, really pretty much, I would say, starting with Freud. I think the primary division is between conscious and unconscious. Just the normal human experience, of course, is we're born, and it takes really 2 years, more or less, for us to be even aware of our own existence. So we have 2 years of existence on this planet, which is totally unconscious. And yet
incredibly formative experiences occur within those 2 years, with our environment. Then we acquire language, then we get older. We have a bombardment of experiences that we have throughout our lives that we can't even keep in our consciousness or awareness. That's sort of, I think that's the metaphorical meaning of we're only using 10% of our brains. The other 90% of our experiences, for you and me to go day to day, we can't keep that all in mind. And yet those things happen to us. They've all had an effect on us. They all feature. So I'd say the primary division is between conscious and unconscious. And so to become undivided, to become individuated, means to bring as much as one can of one's unconscious experience into one's awareness. And that's just what Jung called the personal unconscious. That's just what you and I have experienced in our actual literal existence on this earth. Jung posited that there's a collective unconscious that we participate in as well. There's a commonality of human experiences we all have just by virtue of being human. We have an experience of birth, we have an experience of death, we have an experience of our parents, mother, father. We have an experience of gender-related, male, female, androgynous. We have all kinds of experiences of victory, experiences of loss.
Being Italian
is an archetypal experience, So yeah, exactly. We have experiences that are shared by other human beings that we participate in simply by virtue of being human. And there are specific personal experiences of ours that tap into what he called those archetypal experiences of the collective unconscious. So, Freud talked a great deal about the personal unconscious, and Jung didn't at all dispute that. But Jung augmented it by saying that, in fact, what he noticed was that people were experiencing aspects of common human experiences directly in their dreams or in their everyday lives that had more of an archetypal quality to them, that had a commonality with other people. And I would say that, so that's where you say, in answer to your question, how are we divided? I'd say that's the primary division, is between consciousness and unconsciousness. Sometimes things are kept unconscious because they're unacceptable morally or in terms of civilization or society. That was sort of Freud's point. They were repressed. Right. Sometimes they're just forgotten. There's just not enough room in our brains to keep it all into awareness. And sometimes they just they're in potential, but they've just never yet been experienced. So, I'm a young person and I'm having dreams about being old. And I'm not yet old, but I am old in my, there's, in other words, there's a potential experience that's happening sometimes through dreams. Synchronistic events often have an archetypal quality to them. They bring to an awareness something that is on a deeper level of someone's awareness that they need to pay attention to in a particular way to be more integrated.
So I'm going to tell you about an experience I had, and I would be interested to know, and this is where I first got interested in the subject of synchronicity and whether it would be a synchronistic event. So it was one of the times I came to Germany before I lived in Germany, in Berlin. And I went to a weekend festival of workshops, and for the very first time ever, I did a shamanic workshop where you sort of are sent into a light trance by drumming, and you have to imagine going into a tree and being sent up either into the upper world or the lower world. And at this point, my mother was in a coma because she'd had a stroke. She was in her mid-80s, and she was sort of lying between life and death. And in the shamanic journey, I had an experience of sitting round her bed with all of female relatives of the family, and then behind them the generation behind and behind and behind. And in fact, we went back through all living creatures, although they were all very much Western living creatures. We had bears and wolves, no giraffes and elephants. And, I watched her go up into heaven, and it was the most beautiful experience. And, it was lovely. And I mean, that in a sense was what I needed at that point. And so afterwards, because I had no idea about shamanic journeys and what it meant, I had a conversation with the guy and asked him, you know, what happened? Did this really happen? Is this a symbolic? You know, explain all of this. The question I wanted to have answered was, could I actually trust this as a useful experience rather than something that was conjured up out of my imagination? And obviously he couldn't answer that question. But the synchronistic part of it was that the workshop finished, and I went home a couple of days after the workshop finished, and in the queue I saw the guy who was the shaman, and so we chatted in the departure lounge, and then it turned out we were in the same row, actually sitting next to each other. That I was A and he was C, and we asked B to swap with us so we didn't talk over. But
Right.
the third part of the third coincidence was that although we arrived at different times, his luggage and my luggage arrived next to each other on the conveyor belt. And, you know, I felt that felt to me a meaningful coincidence, that we would be on the same flight, you know, possible, but that we should be sitting in the same row almost next to each other, and then our luggage should come together. It felt like something was trying to tell me that this had meaning in some sense. So would you see this as a synchronistic experience?
I would, in the sense that the synchronistic event is not to be found outside. It's to be found inside. And for you, as you tell the story to me, it becomes clear to me that you experienced those coincidences with the shaman, the shamanic facilitator, as confirmatory. I mean, your question after having your own internal experience was, is this trustworthy? Like, in other words, is there a connection between inside and outside? And here are all these, is it meaningful? And so that's the question. And so what you're being sort of treated to is a certain way in which there are connections. You know, here you are, completely random connections with this person you didn't know before. And yet, and not just one, not just two, but three, right? In other words, that's it. One of the things I guess I would say about it, and this is what people often do exactly what you did to me. They're just like, is this meaningful? And I'm like, well, you tell me if it's meaningful to you. I don't tell you. It's not, you know, the meaning of it is subjective. And Jung was entirely confident and conscious of the way, or what I want to say, affirming of the way in which, if you tell me it's meaningful, it's meaningful. Yeah, right.
And so maybe the lesson of synchronicity is that we have to value our own judgment as much as anybody else's.
I would say more than anyone else's, to tell you the truth, are almost exclusive to anyone else's when it comes to our own inner lives. You know, when we're talking about interior experiences, all there is subjectivity, right? And so that's why when you say, can I trust this? I'm like, well, yeah, you can trust it. Your dream or your vision or your experience or your meaning has happened. It happened, but it happened exclusively to you. No one outside can affirm or confirm it for you. One does have to affirm it for oneself. So when you say, well, is this just my imagination? I'm like, well, let's remove the word just from that sentence, because your imagination, this was Jung's point, your imagination, my imagination, are real. They're real in a different order of reality than this lamp or that, you know, that book, but they're real interior. You actually had that vision. You actually had that experience. You did experience bumping into the facilitator repeatedly in the course of your journey home as significant. You tell me it's meaningful. It's meaningful, period. That's the end of the sentence. It's meaningful.
So one of the great advantages of becoming a supporter to this podcast is you can actually write a letter into us, and myself and my guest will discuss it. And so here is the letter I've got today. I seem to wake up about 3 or 4 a.m. and on many occasions my mind will be full of anxiety. Sometimes it will be money worries or some official letter that needs my attention, about which I fabricate 1,000,001 problems. Sometimes the fears can be centered on my nearest and dearest, the result of some biopsy or that scan, or what will happen if this or that happens. Less often it's something stupid or thoughtless that I did which keeps me awake. In the light of day, I know my worst case scenarios are just that, but I seem to live with anxiety humming in the background, like the fridge, always there, sometimes barely audible, and others completely overwhelming. I meditate and I try not to procrastinate too much, and generally I can keep some sense of proportion. But I can have 2 or 3 nights in a row where I have to stop myself from pacing around the house. It can often take 2 or so hours to go back to sleep. How can I find more peace? So what are your thoughts when you hear that, Robert?
Well, I'm going to put on a different hat, right? So when I first read you had sent me that letter so we could discuss it. When I first read that letter, I was like, well, that's completely normal. That's a very normal sleep pattern, I would say. My guess is the writer of the letter is middle-aged or older. That's probably the case. There's a wonderful series on science here in the United States, which is probably available on the internet as well for your listeners, called Nova. And I just recently this week, maybe this is synchronistic, just recently this week, watched their episode called The Mysteries of Sleep. There's an awful lot of current research now going on about sleep and patterns of sleep because it's a big issue in modern life. And so now with all the technology, they're able to put all these, electrodes on everyone's brain and notice what's happening in different parts of the brain as people sleep and as they go through the different phases of sleep. And so this program makes kind of clear what happens in a normal night's sleep is usually, optimally, what would happen is the first part of the night, we enter into deep, long wave, brainwave sleep. And that's where we get our primary rest. And as we move toward morning, what happens is the waves get shallower and shallower, and we're coming to consciousness. So what this person is writing about is, I'd almost say it's a universal experience, to tell you the truth. People were writing about this in the Middle Ages, actually, right? Medieval times. Is you are slowly becoming more and more aware as we come toward morning. And as we age, our sleep gets shallower and shallower and shallower. So he or she, their analogy to the refrigerator humming in the background, but sounding like, a truck coming down your kitchen in the middle of the silence of the night is very apt, right? And so what happens is that, the underlying anxieties that they may have get very magnified because there are no other external distractions at 3 a.m. Their sleep is already shallow and they're kind of half aroused. And so what I liked about the letter was that person's awareness that the things they perseverate about at 3 a.m. are going to look really different at 8 a.m. after they've had their coffee when the sun has come up. And I actually think that's kind of the healthiest way to do it. It's just a normal part of the sleep cycle is what I would say, right? Sometimes it may take the form of a dream. We dream as we're coming to awareness, and the dreams may feel like they go on for hours and hours, but it turns out sleep research has shown that they really only last a matter of seconds because, the density of our brain action is such that it feels like hours when it's actually, electrical impulses in our brains that go for just a few seconds. But that's what I would say. I don't know, unless what happens then, however, is that sometimes, unlike this writer, thank God, but sometimes people then become anxious about their anxiety. And so they get into this feedback loop in which, and this person is sort of going there, how can I get more peace? I'm like, well, A, this is a completely normal sleep pattern. B, you're aware that at 3 a.m., you're probably not thinking clearly. So let's just wait to solve that problem at 9 a.m. after we've had our coffee and we've discussed it with someone. And I think the best thing to do, and this is what sleep researchers are actually recommending these days, is to distract yourself. In other words, you don't lay in bed trying to go back to sleep if you can't go back to sleep. You get up, you go do something. Now, I have a series of podcasts as well as TV programs that I know are going to put me right to sleep. You know, you're
a regular listener to this podcast.
Not your podcast, thank God, but we're like history podcasts. I'm like, okay, that's great. Or we have this, there's a UK version of it too, Antiques Roadshow, in which people go around doing it. Oh man, that just puts me to sleep in 20 minutes. We have these like middle class people droning on about their China, and I'm like, oh, I'm right asleep, right? What you want to do is you want to find something really very bland, sort of boring. You definitely do not want to be watching your serial killer documentaries or your horror shows. You don't want anything arousing. However, and this is, again, I'm a psychotherapist, so this is like good health habits. Don't use your cell phone. Don't use the internet. You really don't want that blue light coming into your eyes and waking you up. You really want something as kind of anodyne as just audio, audio sleep program. Now there are plenty of sleep programs, but that's really the best thing to do. I mean, I think rather than exacerbate what is in fact a normal part of the sleep cycle by getting anxious about it, calling it insomnia, and then going about these things, I think what happens with a lot of folks is if they just if they can organize their lives to accommodate that normal sleep cycle, what they find is it doesn't become problematic, right? Sometimes you can't. If you have to be at work at 8 a.m. and you are awake at 3, you're going to have a difficult day after a night like that. But if there's a way in which, especially these days, as life changes a little bit with all the exigencies of a pandemic, right? People are working more at home. Modern life is allowing them. If you can arrange your day to accommodate your normal sleep cycle, then it's not a problem. And that's not a problem. So yeah, I was glad to hear it by the end of that particular letter, which you shared with me beforehand, that this person seemed to have a fairly good perspective on like what place it has. But if you go to the Psalms, for example, there's like, I am awake in the middle of the night calling upon thy name, O Lord. It's a very archetypal kind of almost biological part of the sleep cycle that this person is describing in the letter.
And do you think that this person needs to be concerned about their anxiety during the day? Do you think that they're not actually aware of enough of their anxiety during the daytime, so that's why it's popping up more in the night time?
Well, anxiety is an interesting thing. I mean, the things that this person is mentioning in the letter, I sort of say to people too. I mean, it's often not a very welcome thing to hear from your psychotherapist, but there are in fact things that I think anxiety is appropriate to have about. If the person has actually got a health issue, how are they not going to be anxious about the results of their biopsy? I feel like it's an emotionally appropriate response to have a certain level of anxiety or fear about that. Or if they have financial troubles, how are they not going to have a certain level of anxiety or fear about that? So we distinguish between what we might call sort of appropriate anxiety and clinical anxiety. If somebody has clinical anxiety, the anxiety is about something that actually has never occurred to them, isn't going to occur to them, and they're simply having a free-floating anxiety. Whereas if somebody's actually reacting to a realistic situation, what they are discussing at the end of the letter is actually appropriate. In other words, while you're going about living your life, you're not aware of it. But then in the silence of the night, and particularly kind of at the state of, later evening arousal during your sleep cycle, you become aware of how anxious you actually are about this thing. And so that's what we look at. We look at, does the anxiety have a negative impact on someone's life? Is it appropriate? And that is to say, is it actually connected to a real situation and therefore appropriate? Or is it sort of free floating and kind of crazy? What I would suggest, and this is maybe the final thing, is don't do anything you can't undo at 3 a.m. Don't get on the internet and text your ex about how sad you are about having. Don't buy a house because you're afraid you might go broke. Don't pay off your credit card. Do not act out. So don't do anything on the basis of your 3 a.m. anxiety. Just wait until the morning, and then it'll look really different when you're actually awake, thinking more clearly, and all the other various concerns, everyday concerns of your life are taking their appropriate place as you go about living. So I was really happy to hear that letter, because that's actually something that I talk about a great deal with certain clients, you know.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much to the person who wrote in with that. So, Robert, as I've invited you to be a guest on The Meaningful Life and be my witness here today, I have to ask you, what makes your life meaningful?
Yeah, that was, God bless you. That's a great question. I think, it puts all of us on the spot that come onto this podcast. But it's a good question to reflect on. I would say that maybe the top of the list, the first thing I'll just, I'll pretend I'm in therapy and just spontaneously associate. The first thing I'd say is relationships. Like, in other words, I think my relationships with the people I love and that I share my life with have made my life really meaningful. I mean, meaningful in the sense that they help me know myself better, as well as to have a sense of my own capacity to give and to love and to connect with other people. I feel like those loving, giving connections are the best of what it means to be human. And so it's in those relationships that I live my humanity most fully. So I would say my relationships make my life really the most meaningful. And so the second would be sort of the subcategory of that, which would be to say my work. I mean, my work as a psychotherapist in particular. In other words, sometimes I'm effective. Sometimes the problems that somebody brings in are kind of beyond anyone's to fix, really. And all I can do, or any of us can do, is to be present with them and their suffering as they go through it.
And hold it.
Yeah. It's a sort of you'd say, sort of from the spiritual standpoint, a ministry of presence. The help you're giving is simply by being with or accompanying somebody in their journey. And
possibly stopping them doing something at 3 a.m. that
they
regret as well.
True.
Or the daytime equivalent of 3 a.m. action.
Absolutely. So I think my work makes my life meaningful. It's a very unusual week in which on Friday afternoon I don't close the door to my office and I did my best, but at least I tried to make someone else's life better and to help them be healthy and whole and find some meaning. So my work has made my life incredibly meaningful in some ways. And I think the third thing is maybe my creativity. I mean, I do a host of different things creatively. I was trained musically. I make music, I bake, I knit, I have a garden, I have a house. I mean, there's a way in which my crafts, what I craft in my life, the beauty that I create, the skill that I'm honing, the food that I make, the enjoyment that I get out of the material life, my creativity, the artwork I have around here, all of those sorts of things. I think my creativity makes my life meaningful. I would say my ability to kind of delve into that and really enjoy it. Once again, I mean, I kind of feel like our time here on this earth is relatively brief. We kind of go in and out, especially at age 63, as I am now. To live your life fully day to day, immersed in the beauty and pleasure of the material world through one's creativity in various ways, to meet the world and fashion it, as well as to have the world meet you and for you to experience it and savor it. That makes my life meaningful. So that's why I would say relationships, work, and creativity have all made my life incredibly meaningful.
Well, thank you very much for being my guest. This is the point where we finish for most people, but if you're a member of our supporters circle, you'll be able to hear us talk about what I've learned, and we'll see if Robert's learned anything. And he's going to tell us the 3 things he knows deep down to be true. If you want to know what those are, here is details of what you need to do. Well, this is when we can relax because we're with friends now, people who are supporting us. One of the things that I was sort of really interested in was this idea that synchronicity is to re-enchant our lives. And I wondered if your life had been re-enchanted. Are you living in a way that you are conscious of synchronicity, and that do you believe in a bigger presence that's arranging all of this or not?
Well, if you're asking me specifically, I don't really feel like my life has ever been disenchanted. so I would say, yeah, I think those of us that go into this profession in particular have a sort of certain quantum of spirituality or intuition or aliveness to the immaterial, the non-material aspects of people's lives and our own lives, in which I sort of walk through life with it. I don't think this is that much of an exaggeration. Well, a continual experience of enchantment with the world. I mean, there's sometimes disenchantment with human nature. not all that thrilled about the way certain people act, but the world itself. I mean, if I get away from the world, I think nature heals in a certain sense. So I would never say that I've ever really suffered from a great deal of disenchantment. I sort of walk around in a state of continual wonder in some ways. I was raised within the Christian tradition, raised Lutheran, currently a practicing Roman Catholic spiritual director. The spiritual lives, and this particularly in California, there's a wide panoply of spiritual and religious practices. It's a very sort of rich tapestry of belief and cultures around spirituality and religion. And my late husband was a professor of psychology, comparative religions too, and taught religion and philosophy for 30 years. And so, I sort of live within the world of the spirit in a particular way. So I would say, yeah, no, I definitely walk around with a sense of enchantment about it. It's not to say I don't have my dark times. And, I think either looking historically or even in the present time, when it comes to society or politics, it's very easy to kind of get discouraged about certain things. But what I find is a certain buoyancy of my spirit underneath all of that. I have a certain level of optimism about it in a particular way, or at least at the very most, a level of acceptance about it, a kind of realistic acceptance about the imperfections of life and a certain peace around that, and my as I was just saying, I think my approach is to do the best I can to make it better to the extent that I'm given to. And if I can't, then I just let it go and I make my peace with it and move forward. So
that's the thing I'm going to take away in particular, is that idea that we need to re-enchant our lives. I think that's a beautiful idea that I'm going to continue to explore. Is there anything that talking today has pointed up for you?
Well, I think it's the fact that you're British, the fact that you're in Berlin, and the wonder that you and I have the capacity to now in the modern world connect in this sort of a fashion, have this level of a depth of conversation, is just a delight. There's a way in which I grew up in a world in which, the closest contact that I had with anyone outside of my immediate circle was to write a letter that would take 3 weeks to get somewhere and then another 3 weeks to get back. There's an immediacy of contact. There's an openness of the world that our podcast, that I relish about our podcast. And so I would say it's the actual experience of doing the podcast rather than anything you and I particularly talked about content-wise. It's more the process. It's just so delightful. I can just sit here in my home and talk to you across the world and about important things. That's lovely.
So let's have the first thing that you know deep down to be true.
Ooh, boy, you're putting us all on the spot with these. I love this. This is great. I love it. I do know there's an unconscious. Now, people like to deny that there's an unconscious. They like to live thinking. Most people like to live thinking that who they know themselves to be is all there is. What I know to be true is that it's not true. What is true is there's much more to us than we're conscious of. There is an unconscious. So I would say that's definitely what I know to be true.
And that it's pressing on us, this unconscious.
Yes, it's pressing on us. It's going to have,
Yeah, maybe that's the second thing that I guess I would say I know to be true. What I also know to be true is it will have an impact on you, whether you like it or not.
It will have its day.
It will have its day. Often that will be through others. It'll come to you indirectly. A lot of times it will come from the inside out. Sometimes it'll come from the outside in.
How does it come from the outside in?
Well, for example, like there are many stories, like in the second book I wrote about synchronicity, about families. In particular, I'm a marriage and family therapist. Things about themselves that parents deny, or things about their relationship they deny, the kids pick up unconsciously and then enact. So if you deny it, your kids are going to throw it in your face. And believe me, I've made a career of it. It's funding my retirement. I tell my interns we're never going out of business. But like, that's just one example of the way in which the unconscious life of the parents gets presented to them through the conscious action of their children often, which is why it's so infuriating. And that's one of the things I try to help with. An example of it.
I'll give you a personal example of it. I come from a family that wanted to deny feelings. Feelings were inconvenient things they didn't want to have. What do? I talk about feelings all the time.
All the time. To the vexation of your parents where they're around.
Yeah. I mean, if I really want to upset my father, I tell him I love him. That really gets him.
Like I said, there's a great example. So that's the second thing I know to be true. The unconscious is inescapable. Not only does it exist, but you are not going to be able to escape it, right? And
the third thing
I guess I would, and this maybe has to do more with my phase of life than anything, but we're talking at age 63 is
I'm 62, so we're in the same.
So there we are.
We're in the same department.
That I would say, how can I say this? Let me see if I can articulate it. That loss is a reality.
Yeah.
That I know to be true.
We've both lost a partner.
Loss, as we live, life is in a way a consistent series of losses. And that's just a truth. Now, one can stand in all kinds of relationships to that truth. One can resist it, deny it, rail against it. I've consistently chosen to acknowledge it and in a way be with it, and even at times maybe embrace it, because I've found over the course of my now long life, I've resisted loss as a youth, but now that I see when things are taken away or I've lost things, sometimes things about me, or sometimes relationships, they've often, if I've been in the right relationship to it, opened me up to something deeper, or have given me the opportunity to make my peace with the imperfections and complexities of things, But I would say, the headline is loss is a reality. And I think, the corollary to that is one can stand in a wide variety of relationships to that truth. And I choose to stand in a particularly more sort of accepting and conscious relationship to it. I mean, I think I was sort of hit over the head with it in my generation with the HIV epidemic. Early on in my life, I had to deal with an awful lot of losses that seemed really very much out of time. Young people dying around me at a point in my life that,
And you were young too.
Yeah, it was young. I mean, it was not the phase appropriate time to be, dealing with that level of loss. So that's always sort of aware. But I think it has stood me in really good stead over the course of my life. So that was the third thing I guess I would say, that loss is a reality. It's painful, and it also has its place in our life.
Well, we're certainly ending on a deep moment there. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's been extraordinary.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been great being here.
Right, now I need to find the button to stop the recording. Right, stop recording, yes. Do you want to stop the recording? Yes.